Hi, it's Frank. Today I was going to talk about a melody for the song called R.L.E. This is a traditional American song that's 16 measures long. It features an opening phrase of 4 measures that's repeated. That's the first half. The second half features 8 measures that do have some repetition but actually are different. So that would be our B section if the first part would be called A. The reason I chose this is because unlike some of the recent melodies I've looked at, there are no triads being laid out from beginning to end in any inversion throughout any of this song, interestingly enough. This also features, the song does, some interesting secondary dominants that help push our ear towards things. And the way the melody works with those secondary dominants is what I thought might also be interesting. So just to dive right in the first measure, and by the way, we're in the key of F, and you can find a link to this PDF in the description. We are really only dealing with the 5th root and the leading tone of that first chord, F. There's no third in this particular measure. From there, we move into a G7 chord. That's the secondary dominant that would be labeled as a 5/7 of 5 in this key. And interestingly enough, when we get to that chord, we see a G note and a D chord, a D note rather, and then a G again. So we really just see the root and the 5th of that chord being emphasized. The chord after that is the 5/7 of the key, so the preceding secondary dominant does its job. Interestingly enough, here the melody actually uses an F note to start with. That's, of course, the tonic of the key we're in, but that sound happens to be kind of tense. If you were to, for instance, try and play that against the chord C7, that E to F difference would really stand out. So here it's used just as a passing note to get us to the leading tone, which is E, and then to the note D as in dog, and then back to the note E. So twice in this measure with the C7 chord, it's worth mentioning, the leading tone, or the third of this chord, is played. So really the F and the D are serving as some notes around that literally help enclose it, just to add some interest. That little rhythmic pattern we see there also, where we start on a high note, go down, and then go back up to the note we just played. We're going to see that repeated in the song. Here's the idea then of a rhythmic theme, the same way you can have a harmonic or melodic theme. In the last measure of this line, we see a tonic note, F, with an F chord behind it, and then the note C, the other half note in this measure, which is the tonic of the next chord, C. The second line, measures 5 through 8, are virtually identical, with the exception that measure 8 ends with a whole note on the note F, and the chord backing it is just the tonic chord. So basically then what we have is a 4-measure phrase that's repeated. That's our A section. As we move into the second half of the song, beginning in measure 9, we move to the melody note A, which is repeated 3 times, twice as quarter, then as half note. Interestingly, it's the first time we see the third of the F major chord used at all. In the entire first half, we had only the root, the 5th, and once again, the leading tone of that chord that showed up. So here's the third. That's interesting mostly because in Western music, we often rely on thirds to outline chords. Specifically, of course, they help us define major and minor. And again, that's absent in the first 8 measures of this particular melody. In measure 10, the next measure of this half, we have a secondary dominant, A7. This A7, of course, helps drive our ear toward the 6th of this key, A being the third, which means we make the chord A7. It's functioning as a 5/7 of 6, 6 in this case being D minor, which is exactly, by the way, what happens in measure 11. As for the melody in measure 10, we just repeat the same 3 notes we played in the previous measure. Notice how in doing that, we move from having A represent the third of F to A representing the root of the chord A7. In D minor, we start with the same note. That's measure 11, and that's the 5th of that particular chord. I always love to see melodies that repeat notes so that when we actually play them, the chords behind them are changing, which means the perception of how that note is working within that chord is, of course, being altered. It's a great way to minimize changing notes a lot, of course, in melody writing, but also it just creates interesting sounds when you hear an A here versus here versus here. There is, of course, a unity from repeating the note, but the fact the background has changed is what's always worth noting. Once we get to the D minor chord, we actually see the note A lead to G, and then to F, and then back to G. So here's another case of that kind of enclosure I was talking about. In this case, the G note, interestingly enough, is the one we enclose. Specifically, that's interesting because, of course, G is not a chord tone in D minor. We only have D, F, and A in a D minor triad. So really what's going on is we're actually encircling a note that does not belong to that chord, the G note, with two notes that do, the A, which is the fifth, and the F, which is the third. So it's kind of backwards of what you might expect. Again, there's all kinds of melodies. So this is just another example of one. And that's why I wanted to touch on it, though, is because it's a little different than the ones I've looked at recently. Once we leave measure 11 to get to measure 12, we once again return to an A7 chord. And the melody note is once again the tonic of this chord. It's A. It's also worth noting, as I said earlier, that between measures 3, 7, and 11, the same rhythmic theme is there and the same little enclosure is used, going from a high note to the note below it, to the note below that, and then right back to the note you just came from on the second beat. We're going to see the same thing happen again in the second to last measure of the song, measure 15, by the way. On that last line of music, beginning with 13, we do return to the tonic chord F, but once again here we've got the third in it. Again, as a contrast to the fact that in the first half we had no third for the chord F, now we've seen it twice on this in this half. In measure 9, and then again now in measure 13. Interestingly enough, this measure is split with a D7 chord, which is functioning as a secondary dominant, in this case to help drive our ear toward the second of this key, which is G, the supertonic note. So the D7 chord here, though, features a B flat in the melody, which is a very tense sounding chord. It's only a quarter note and it immediately moves off that to A. But it's interesting in that it comes right after we've established or re-established the tonic. So again, a lot going on here with surprisingly a little bit of material. So from that measure, measure 14, we move to the G7 chord. As expected, it's the 2, but in this case, it's also being used as a secondary dominant, similar to what we saw in the first half of the song. So this G7 then is that 5-7 of 5, and the melody here is as it was presented earlier. It's just G, D as in dog to G, the root to the fifth, back to the root of the chord. The last two measures of this song include the 5-7, C7 chord, and then of course the tonic chord there, F at the end. Measure 15, as I said earlier, uses the same rhythmic theme that was set up in measures 3 and 7, and it was used again in measure 11 with different notes. Here, however, in measure 15, it's the exact same notes we saw presented in measures 3 and 7. So those last two measures are directly tying to what we've already seen, technically the last three measures, what we saw in the first half of the song, rhythmically and also harmonically, because again, we're seeing notes repeated between measures 2, 3, and 4, 6, 7, and 8, and then here again in 14, 15, and 16. The song does end with just the tonic chord the way it did at the end of measure 16, with a whole note in the melody as well. So, big picture type stuff here. In no single measure do we actually see a complete triad used in any inversion, even with any passing notes between it. Instead, what we see is all the notes diatonic to the key of F, but with certain notes emphasized in ways which would seem contrary to some of the stuff we've talked about. Now, here again is this idea that there are some rules or procedures we follow in music, but really all bets are off when you come up with something interesting. If it sounds good, it usually is. But from an analysis point of view, that measure in particular with the D minor stands out, I would say, because although we've got a similar rhythmic theme to help unify it to the first half of this song, what we see going on in the melody is a little counter to what we might expect, which is to say the note that gets emphasized of those four is a note that is non-chordal. It's not in that actual chord. That's the G I'm referring to. Now, we do bookend that with notes that are important to that triad, the third and the fifth respectively. But again, the note that's played twice most often in that measure doesn't belong to that chord. And that creates a really interesting sound as you move from and to that A7 chord, which, by the way, does contain a G. So again, there's a larger bit of harmonic stuff going on here if you step back a little bit. Once again, I just wanted to cover this briefly this week to go ahead and talk about how we're seeing melodies now that go beyond just simply putting triads together in any inversion and moving from measure to measure with some passing notes. There's all variety of melodies out there. That's what this is, of course, meant to help emphasize. And we'll be continuing to look at some of those as we move into other songs and start talking more about how we can break up triads to use them in melodies, both in original compositions as well as when arranging. Take care.